I had been sitting at a desk for too long, staring at screens, answering emails, and living in the constant hum of the city. I needed a reset, something to break the cycle of stress and monotony. A solo hiking trip in Olympic National Park seemed like the perfect escape. 3 days, just me and the untamed wilderness. No deadlines, no noise, no people, just the quiet hum of nature. The first day went smoothly. The air was cool, carrying the scent of damp earth and pine. Sunlight filtered through the towering evergreens, casting long, dappled shadows across the narrow trail. The only sounds were my own footsteps, crunching against the dirt, and the occasional rustling of unseen animals moving through the underbrush. By late afternoon, I had hiked deep into the forest and set up camp near a small clearing, not far from a slow-moving creek. Now that a midnight fall was falling, fireflies were spiraling across the clearing, not far from a slow-moving creek. That night, I lay in my tent, listening to the water trickle over smooth stones. The stillness of the place was almost too perfect, like the forest itself was holding its breath. I must have drifted off at some point because when I woke, I wasn't sure what had pulled me from sleep. Then I heard it. A rustling sound, low and deliberate, just outside my tent. I held my breath. Probably just a raccoon or a deer, I told myself, but something felt off. The sound wasn't erratic like an animal foraging. It was steady, purposeful. I reached for my flashlight, hesitated, then slowly unzipped the tent flap just enough to peek outside. My breath caught in my throat. There was nothing. The clearing was empty, bathed in pale moonlight. The trees stood still, their dark silhouettes pressing in around me. I scanned the area, heart hammering, but there was no movement, no sound. Just the wind sighing through the branches. Trying to shake the unease creeping up my spine, I zipped the tent back up and lay there, wide-eyed, until exhaustion finally won out. The next morning, I woke to an eerie silence. No birds chirping, no rustling of small creatures in the undergrowth, just a dead, heavy stillness. As I stepped out of the tent, stretching my stiff limbs, I noticed something that made my stomach tighten. Footprints. They weren't mine. The prints were faint, partially erased by the night's dampness, but I could see them clearly. Several sets, circling my tent. My first instinct was to rationalize it. Maybe another hiker had passed through. Maybe I hadn't noticed them before. But the more I looked, the more certain I was that they hadn't been there when I set up camp. A cold, crawling sensation crept up the back of my neck. A cold, crawling sensation crept up the back of my neck. I shook off the feeling and packed up my gear quickly. I'd planned to hike deeper into the park, but suddenly, the idea of moving further from civilization didn't seem so appealing. Instead, I decided to head back toward a more well-traveled section of the trail. By midday, the forest felt different. The towering evergreens, once majestic and calming, now loomed over me, their thick trunks creating walls that seemed to close in tighter the further I walked. The silence remained, so complete it felt unnatural, like the world had gone mute. Then the fog rolled in. Thick and cloying, it seeped through the trees, swallowing the trail ahead of me. My GPS flickered, the signal cutting in and out. I tried to stay calm, telling myself I was still on track. But then, through the haze, I saw it. A figure, just barely visible, standing motionless in the fog ahead. Relief flooded through me. Another hiker. I wasn't alone. "Hey," I called out, waving. "Over here." The figure didn't move. A prickling unease slithered through my gut. "Are you okay?" I asked, stepping closer. And then, it was gone. Not like someone turning and walking away. Just gone. The fog shifted, swirling around the spot where the figure had been, but there was nothing there. No footsteps, no movement, just empty trail. I swallowed hard, trying to slow my breathing. Maybe my mind was playing tricks on me. The fog, the exhaustion. It was easy to imagine things that weren't there, but I didn't feel crazy. I felt watched. That night I built a fire, even though I didn't need it for warmth. The flickering flames gave me a sense of control, however false. I sat close, my knife within reach, eyes darting to every shifting shadow beyond the light. Then, just past midnight, the sound came again. Scraping. Not rustling, not footsteps. Scraping. like something dragging against bark. My blood turned to ice. I grabbed my flashlight, my fingers trembling, and stepped out of the tent. The night was thick with fog, the fire's glow barely reaching the edge of the clearing. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness, scanning the trees. Nothing. Then, just as I was about to retreat, movement, a shadow darting between the trees. I barely saw it, just a flicker of motion faster than anything should be able to move. My breath hitched and I stumbled backward toward my tent. I didn't sleep. I just sat there, knife clutched in my hand, waiting for the sun to rise. At first light, I packed up and started walking fast. My GPS was dead and I was running low on water, but I didn't care. I needed to get out. Hours passed. The oppressive silence remained. Then, as I crested a small hill, I saw them. People. A group of teenage campers and their counselors. I must have looked half mad because the moment they saw me, they rushed over, offering water, asking if I was okay. I could barely speak. I just nodded, gripping the bottle they handed me like a lifeline. Later, when the rangers arrived, I told them everything. The footprints, the figure in the fog, the sounds. They listened, but I could tell they weren't convinced. "You were alone, tired, probably dehydrated," one of them said. "It's easy for the mind to play tricks out here." I didn't argue. Maybe they were right. Maybe I had imagined it. But a few days later, after I was home, I came across a news article. Hikers in Olympic National Park had reported abandoned campsites, strange noises at night. Some even claimed to have seen shadowy figures in the fog. I wasn't crazy. I wasn't alone. Something was out there, and I would never, never go back. I've always believed the wilderness has a way of stripping you down to your rawest self. No distractions, no noise, just you and whatever waits in the dark corners of the world. I thought I was prepared for that kind of solitude. I was wrong. I'd read about what happened to that hiker in Olympic National Park, the one who claimed something was out there, watching him, stalking him through the fog. I remember shaking my head at the article, assuming exhaustion and paranoia had played tricks on his mind. People go out into the woods looking for silence, and when they get it, they start to lose themselves in it. That was my theory anyway. But theories don't hold up when you find yourself in the same kind of silence, the kind that listens back. I had been planning my solo photography trip for months. The Redwood National Park was the perfect place to escape, to capture untouched beauty without the distractions of tourists and city noise. I set out early in the morning, my backpack heavy with camera equipment, my tent packed neatly against my back. I chose a remote area of the park, far from the well-trodden paths, where the trees stood like ancient sentinels, their massive trunks stretching toward the sky. For the first few hours, everything was perfect. The light filtered through the canopy, turning the forest floor into a shifting mosaic of gold and green. The air smelled rich, damp, like old earth and rain. I snapped pictures as I hiked, each shot a perfect blend of stillness and life. By late afternoon, I found a small stream, its water clear and cold, snaking between the roots of a fallen tree. It seemed like the perfect spot to set up camp. I pitched my tent near the bank, cooked a small meal over my portable stove, and watched the sun dip behind the trees. As night fell, the forest came alive with the soft murmurs of nature, the distant hoot of an owl, the rustling of unseen creatures in the underbrush. It was peaceful in a way that made my bones relax. I crawled into my tent, zipped myself in, and let the quiet lull me to sleep. Sometime in the night, I woke up. At first, I wasn't sure why. My breath was slow, my body heavy with sleep. But then I heard it. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, close. I held my breath, listening. The sound moved in a slow, shuffling pattern, circling my tent. Not an animal. The steps were too heavy, too deliberate. "Hello?" My voice was barely above a whisper. The footsteps stopped. I waited, heart pounding, ears straining in the suffocating silence. Nothing. After what felt like hours, I convinced myself it had been a trick of my half-asleep mind. I told myself it was just a raccoon, or maybe a stray deer passing through. I closed my eyes, forcing myself back into uneasy sleep. By morning, the memory felt distant, like a bad dream. But when I stepped outside my tent, my stomach dropped. The dirt around my campsite had been disturbed, not just here and there, but in a wide, uneven pattern, like something had been dragged through the underbrush. My first thought was an animal carcass. Maybe a bear had passed through in the night, but then I saw it. A boot print. Not mine. The print was deep, the sole pattern barely visible in the damp earth. I knelt down, pressing my own boot next to it. It was bigger than mine. A sick, creeping feeling slithered up my spine. Someone had been here, watching me, circling my tent while I slept. I packed up my gear quickly, my hands shaking. I told myself I'd imagined things, that my mind was running wild from one strange noise. But as I moved deeper into the woods, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The air had changed. The peaceful hum of the forest was gone. In its place was a thick, smothering silence, pressing against my ears like a warning. And then I saw it, a clearing just off the main trail, hidden behind a wall of thick ferns. At first, it looked like an abandoned campsite. Old clothes were scattered across the ground, torn and dirty, half buried beneath fallen leaves. A pile of bones, small, bleached white, was stacked neatly in the center. I thought they were animal bones at first. I hoped they were animal bones. And then, from the corner of my eye, something moved. A figure stepped out from behind a tree. My breath stopped. He was filthy, his clothes in tatters, his face obscured by a thick, matted beard. But it was his eyes that made my stomach turn to ice. They were locked onto me, unblinking. He didn't speak. He didn't move. I took a slow step back, my body tensed, every instinct screaming at me to run. "Hey," I said, my voice shaking. "I'm just passing through." He didn't respond. He just watched. I took another step back, then another, and finally turned, walking as quickly as I could without breaking into a sprint. The moment I was out of his line of sight, I ran. I didn't know if he was following me. I didn't look back. I just ran, crashing through the underbrush, my heart hammering against my ribs. When I finally reached the parking lot, I felt my knees buckle. My car was in sight, and so was he. He was standing at the tree line, half hidden behind the branches, watching me. I fumbled with my keys, hands shaking so badly I nearly dropped them. The moment I got the door open, I threw myself inside, locking it just as I saw him take a single step forward, then another, and another. He was walking toward my car. I didn't wait. I slammed the engine into gear, tires kicking up gravel as I sped down the dirt road. My hands were so tight on the wheel I thought they might snap. I didn't stop, not until I was miles away. Not until I was back in civilization, surrounded by people, by noise, by safety. I reported everything to the park rangers. They listened, but I could tell they weren't taking it seriously. "Probably just a homeless man," one of them said, "or a drifter." But I knew better. He wasn't just living out there. He was waiting. And I had almost found out what for. I had read Sarah's story, the woman who went on a photography trip in the redwoods, thinking she was alone, only to realize something had been waiting for her in the shadows. I told myself that wouldn't happen to me. I wasn't hiking in California, and I wasn't going to camp near any hidden clearings. I was smarter than that. But the thing about the wilderness is, it doesn't care how prepared you think you are. I wanted silence, true, undisturbed solitude. I had spent the past 16 years teaching high school history in Denver. Loud classrooms, hallway fights, teenagers too addicted to their phones to care about the past. I needed to get away from all of it. So, I packed my tent, my supplies, and my stubborn determination, and drove 6 hours into Black Hills National Forest in South Dakota. The plan was simple, a weekend alone in the woods, just me and nature, no students, no distractions, just peace. Or so I thought. The first night was uneventful. I set up my tent near a quiet, narrow stream, cooked a small dinner, and sat by the fire, watching the flames dance. The forest was still, peaceful, and for the first time in years, I felt the tension in my shoulders begin to ease. But sometime around midnight, I woke up. At first I thought it was the wind, the kind that rattles tree branches, makes them groan like old bones. But then I heard it. A knocking sound, steady, rhythmic. 3 beats, a pause. 3 more beats. It was close. My tent felt too small, too fragile. I held my breath, listening. It came again, slow and deliberate, as if someone, or something, was striking a piece of wood in the darkness. My first thought was an animal. Maybe a deer had bumped into a fallen log. But deer don't knock in patterns. I sat frozen, waiting, my pulse in my throat. Eventually, the sound stopped. The next morning, the forest was too quiet. No birds, no rustling leaves, just an eerie, suffocating stillness that made my skin crawl. When I stepped outside my tent, my breath caught in my throat. There were small stacks of rocks in front of my tent, neatly placed, 4 or 5 in each pile, positioned in a perfect row, like markers. I hadn't put them there. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe I had walked past them the night before and hadn't noticed. Maybe the wind had shifted small stones. I ignored the uneasy feeling twisting in my gut and pressed on, packing my gear and continuing deeper into the forest. By mid-afternoon, I felt it. The weight of eyes, the feeling of being watched. At first, I brushed it off as paranoia. But the further I hiked, the heavier it became, like something was just behind me, just out of sight. That night, I set up camp in a different spot, near an old dead tree that had split in half from a storm. The sky was dark, cloudless, and the fire flickered weakly as I sat beside it, trying to shake the unease that had settled in my bones. Then came the footsteps, heavy, slow, circling my tent. I grabbed my flashlight and my hunting knife. My breath hitched as I listened. The steps stopped whenever I moved. I held my breath. Nothing. I waited, silent. Then from just outside the tent, I heard breathing. Deep, slow, not human. I didn't sleep that night. At first light, I packed up, moving faster than I ever had before. I told myself I was done. I would hike back to the trailhead, get in my car, and never look back. But the forest had other plans. As I walked, I started noticing figures in the trees. Not people, not animals, shadows. At first, I thought it was my mind playing tricks. But then I saw it. A man, standing just inside the tree line. His clothes were tattered, his hair wild, his face too blank, too empty. He didn't move, didn't blink, just watched. I stopped breathing. My mind screamed at me to run, but I didn't. I turned, walking faster, pretending I hadn't seen him. Every instinct told me if I ran, he would chase. I walked. My steps were quick, controlled. Then, as I turned a bend in the trail, I saw him again. But he hadn't moved. He was still 20 feet back, watching. I ran. I didn't care anymore. My legs burned. My lungs ached, but I didn't stop. I ran until I saw my car. I fumbled with my keys, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get the door open. And as I looked up, I saw him, standing at the tree line, watching, not chasing, not moving, just watching. I got in the car, slammed the door, and peeled out of there so fast I nearly ran off the road. When I reached a gas station 20 miles away, I sat in the car, shaking. I couldn't explain what had happened. The park rangers didn't believe me. They said some people live off the grid in those woods. I told them that wasn't what I saw. I saw something else. Something that didn't move like a person. Something that didn't act like a person. I don't hike alone anymore, because I know, somewhere in the Black Hills, he's still standing there, watching. After Alex's encounter in the Black Hills, you might think it was paranoia, his mind playing tricks on him in the isolation of the wilderness. But what if something truly does lurk in those untouched places? Something not human, not explainable. That brings us to Melissa. Melissa had spent years in Alaska's frigid waters, studying marine ecosystems. She wasn't easily frightened. She had seen pods of orcas so close they rocked her kayak, watched grizzlies fish in the streams mere feet from her camp, and weathered brutal Arctic storms. Glacier Bay National Park was supposed to be just another field study. A week alone, mapping changes in marine life populations, setting up cameras along the rocky shoreline, and enjoying the solitude that came with her work. But she was never truly alone.
On the first evening, the tide was low, revealing dark stretches of kelp-covered rocks. She found a place to camp on a narrow strip of beach with steep cliffs at her back and the icy bay stretching endlessly in front of her. The only way out was by kayak. As she set up her small tent, she noticed something strange, a set of footprints leading into the water. Deep, distinct impressions in the wet sand. But there were no footprints leading out. She told herself the waves had washed them away. Perfectly normal. No reason to feel that tight grip of unease settling in her chest. As night fell, she built a small fire, the only warmth in the creeping cold that seeped in from the glaciers. The sky was moonless, the water black as ink. That's when she heard it, the first sound that made her blood run cold. A splash. Not a fish, not the gentle lapping of water against the shore. Something heavier, deliberate. She grabbed her flashlight, scanning the water. At first, nothing, just the slow bobbing of the tide. Then she saw it, a figure, waist deep in the freezing water, barely visible in the dim light, unmoving, watching. Her breath caught in her throat, the light flickered over its face. Only there was no face. Melissa's heart pounded as she stumbled back toward her tent, her hands numb with cold and fear. She shut herself inside, forcing steady breaths. Maybe it was exhaustion, a trick of the shadows. Maybe. Another splash, closer this time. She didn't sleep that night. Every gust of wind, every shift of the tide had her gripping the knife she kept strapped to her belt. When dawn finally broke, she emerged, exhausted but relieved to see nothing out of place. No footprints, no figures, just the wind howling through the fjords. But her radio was dead. The second night, she tried to rationalize it. Maybe she had imagined it. Maybe the batteries in her radio had just died naturally. She convinced herself that fear was the real enemy. So she built her fire again, settled into the night, and listened to the distant cracking of ice breaking off the glaciers. Then she heard it. Wet footsteps on the shore. Melissa froze. Slowly, she reached for her flashlight and turned it toward the sound. At the edge of her campsite, just beyond the reach of the firelight, stood a figure, tall. Thin, motionless, dripping wet. The air around her turned ice cold. The figure didn't move, but she could feel it watching. She tried to step back, but her foot caught on a rock, sending her sprawling. The flashlight slipped from her hands, the beam swinging wildly. When she scrambled to grab it, she shined it back toward the figure. It was gone, but the footprints were there, fresh and deep in the wet sand. Melissa didn't waste another second. She tore through her camp, shoving her gear into her kayak. The tide had risen enough to launch, and she paddled into the open water as fast as she could. The wind cut through her, the paddle trembling in her hands, but she didn't stop. Then, beneath her, something moved. A dark shape gliding just under the surface, following her. She paddled harder, her breaths ragged. It kept pace effortlessly. The water was shallow enough that she could see long, human-like, but wrong. And then it stopped. Melissa didn't look back. She paddled until her arms screamed, until she reached the first ranger station she could find. When she finally told them what had happened, they exchanged glances, uneasy but unsurprised. One of them cleared his throat and said, "You ever hear of the Vanishing Man?" She hadn't. Not then. But later, when she researched it, she found the stories, centuries-old legends of a man who walks into the bay but never comes out, a presence that lingers, watching those who wander too close to the water's edge. Some say he was a lost sailor. Others say he was never human at all. Melissa never returned to Glacier Bay. She refuses to talk about it now, but I spoke to one of her colleagues. They said Melissa still dreams of water, still wakes up gasping for breath, feeling the weight of unseen eyes watching from the deep. And some nights, when the wind is right, she swears she hears footsteps on wet stone. Would you sleep near the water after hearing her story? The thing about the desert is how quiet it gets at night. Not the peaceful kind of quiet, like a mountain lake at sunrise, but a dead, hollow silence. The kind that makes you feel like you've stepped into a place where nothing should be alive. That was the quiet that surrounded me in Death Valley. I had driven out from Vegas after a long haul and needed a break from the city lights. I wasn't the kind of guy who did much hiking, but something about the barren vastness of the desert felt like the right place to clear my head. I planned a simple overnight camp, just me, the open sky, and the endless stretch of sand and rock. By late afternoon, I had picked a flat spot near a dried up riverbed, set up my tent, and stretched out to watch the sunset. The sky turned from gold to deep red, then finally to a purple so dark it felt like the world was folding in on itself. That's when I noticed a figure, far off, standing at the crest of a dune. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light. Shadows played weird games in the desert, but as the last of the sun disappeared, the figure remained, still, watching. I squinted, trying to make out details, but it was too far, just a silhouette against the darkening sky. I turned away to light my campfire. When I looked back, it was gone. The wind picked up, whispering through the rocks. I told myself it was nothing, just another hiker, maybe someone heading back to their car. I'd be fine. But something about the way it stood there, motionless, patient, sent a shiver down my spine. Hours later, I sat by the fire, sipping water and staring into the flames. The desert was pitch black beyond the glow. No sounds, no movement, just the fire crackling. Then, the crunch of footsteps. I snapped my head up. The sound had come from behind my tent. Slow, deliberate steps pressing into the gravelly dirt. I grabbed my flashlight and stood up. Hello? My voice felt small in the emptiness. Nothing. I swept the beam across the desert floor. Nothing but empty sand and scattered rocks. But the footsteps had been real. I was sure of it. I forced myself to shake it off. Maybe an animal, a coyote. Even as I thought it, I knew it wasn't true. I had spent enough nights out west to know the difference between an animal's light scurry and the heavy, measured steps of something or someone deliberate. I locked myself in my tent, gripping my pocket knife. Hours passed in the suffocating silence. Eventually, I drifted into a restless sleep. At dawn, I unzipped my tent, stepping into the crisp morning air. That's when I saw them. Footprints, leading right up to my tent. But here's the thing, there were no prints leading away. A deep, sinking dread coiled in my stomach. I wasn't alone out here. And whoever or whatever had been near me last night hadn't left. I packed up fast. My gut screamed at me to get out of there. As I started hiking back to my truck, I caught movement at the edge of my vision. Up on a ridge to my right, silhouetted against the morning sun, the figure stood again, closer this time. I didn't hesitate. I ran. My boots pounded against the rocky ground as I tore through the valley. My truck was a mile away, parked at a lonely, cracked stretch of road. I pushed myself harder, lungs burning, refusing to look back. The feeling of being watched never left. Finally, my truck came into view. I yanked the door open, threw my pack inside, and slammed it shut. My hands shook as I jammed the key into the ignition. I stole one last glance out the window. The figure was gone. I sped down the highway, not stopping until I hit the Nevada border. But the worst part? When I got home, I opened my pack to put my gear away, my water bottle, my sleeping bag, my map, all accounted for. But sitting neatly at the bottom was something I didn't put there. A small, weathered stone. Smooth, polished, almost like it had been placed there as a gift or a warning. I don't hike anymore. The desert, with its endless horizon and haunting silence, can drive a person mad. Jason barely escaped whatever was lurking in Death Valley, but his story isn't the only one that will keep you awake tonight. Some things in the wild don't just stalk you, they claim you. Emily knew the Appalachian wilderness well. As a wildlife conservationist, she spent more time among the trees than in her own home. When she was assigned a solo research trip deep into Shenandoah National Park, she welcomed the solitude. The first night was peaceful, the crisp Virginia air carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. She set up camp by a small clearing, the only sound the rustling leaves and the distant call of an owl. But then, as the darkness thickened, she heard something else. A long, mournful howl. It wasn't a wolf. It wasn't any animal she recognized. It was deep, almost human, yet distorted, like something trying to imitate a voice but failing. Emily sat up in her tent, gripping her flashlight. The sound came again, closer this time. Her breath hitched as she strained to listen. She told herself it was just her imagination, but the howling didn't stop. It echoed through the forest, circling her campsite. The next morning, she found something that made her stomach drop. Near the edge of her camp, a deer carcass was torn apart, its ribs jutting from the flesh in unnatural angles. The claw marks were too deep, too high up on the trees to be from any known predator. She documented everything, but a deep unease settled in her bones. Something was watching her. She pushed on, hiking deeper into the wilderness. The second night, the howling returned. This time it was accompanied by something worse: breathing. Right outside her tent. Slow, heavy, deliberate. Then came the sound of something being dragged across the forest floor. She reached for her rifle, forcing herself to remain still. The breathing grew closer. Then, silence. She waited, the tension unbearable, until the first light of dawn broke through the trees. When she finally unzipped her tent, the clearing was empty. But the ground was disturbed, as if something large had circled her camp all night. Emily decided to cut her trip short. As she hiked back, the woods seemed different. The trees felt closer, the path more winding than she remembered. Then she saw it. A massive, hunched figure stood just beyond the tree line. Its limbs were long and sinewy, its eyes a glowing, sickly yellow. It didn't move. It only watched. Emily's breath caught in her throat. She slowly backed away, keeping her eyes locked on the creature. Then it moved. Not towards her, but around, disappearing into the trees like a shadow. That's when she heard it. Footsteps, matching hers, keeping pace. It was following her. She ran. The howling erupted again, louder, angrier. The thing was chasing her. She could hear the branches snapping behind her, feel the ground trembling beneath her feet. Her truck was just ahead. She threw herself inside, fumbling with the keys. The howling was right outside. The headlights flashed on, illuminating the trees. Nothing. Just the empty woods. But Emily knew better. She slammed the truck into gear and tore down the dirt road, the echoes of the howls trailing behind her. She never returned to Shenandoah. Later, she researched the local legends and found whispers of something called the Watcher in the woods, an ancient predator, neither human nor animal, that stalked lone travelers, waiting for the perfect moment to take them. Some things in the wild don't want to be seen, and some things, once they've seen you, never let you go. If there's one thing these stories teach us, it's that isolation in nature can be as dangerous as it is beautiful. The wilderness is unpredictable, and sometimes the real terror isn't the terrain or the weather, it's the unknown forces that may be lurking just beyond our line of sight. Nathan learned that the eerie silence of the forest could be watching him just as much as he was watching it. Sarah discovered that danger isn't always loud and aggressive. It can be patient, waiting in the shadows until the perfect moment. Alex realized that sometimes the presence we feel in the wild isn't imagined but real, watching and waiting with motives we'll never fully understand. Melissa's encounter on the shore of Glacier Bay proved that the ocean doesn't always return what it takes. Jason's night in Death Valley reminded us that the desert, as empty as it may seem, can hold things that defy reason. And Emily's horrifying flight from the woods revealed that legends aren't always just stories. Sometimes they're warnings. So, what can we take away from these chilling tales? Never hike alone if you can help it. Strength in numbers isn't just a saying, it can be the difference between safety and becoming a cautionary tale. Trust your instincts. If something feels off, it probably is. That feeling in the pit of your stomach, don't ignore it. Be prepared for the unexpected. Bring extra supplies. Always have a reliable way to call for help, and familiarize yourself with your route before setting out. Leave no trace, but be aware of what others may have left behind. Strange markings, stacked stones, footprints that don't belong to you. Sometimes they mean something. Remember, not everything can be explained. Some stories have endings, but others remain open, lingering in the dark corners of our minds, waiting for the next traveler to stumble upon them. At Enigma of the Unknown, we dive deep into the terrifying mysteries of the world, and it's because of you, our listeners, that we continue uncovering them. Your support, your comments, and your stories fuel this journey. If you have your own unsettling experience in the wild, share it with us in the comments below or send it our way. We'd love to hear it. And if you enjoyed this journey into the unknown, be sure to like, subscribe, and stay with us for more eerie encounters. Until next time, stay safe, stay aware, and remember, sometimes the most haunting things are the ones that never leave a trace. This has been Enigma of the Unknown. The mystery awaits.